In this video, we're going to be designing this chocolate drip cake from scratch. The flavor of cake I'm going to be using is chocolate. If you want to see how I bake the cake, there's a recipe on my channel. So first thing I'm going to do is to sift icing sugar. I'm going to be using 500 gram of icing sugar and 250 gram of margarine. You can use shortening. You can use vegetable shortening if you want a pale or a white frosting, but I'm just going to, this is what was available, so I'm going to use that. I transferred the margarine into a bowl and sifted the icing sugar into it. Now if you notice, the ratio is, if you are using 250 gram of margarine or butter, you're going to be using 500 gram of icing sugar. So the ratio is 1 to 2 margarine to icing sugar. I'm going to stir that in with a spatula. Now, if you have a hand mixer, you want to be careful what type of a hand mixer you use, because some hand mixer can mix too much air into your frosting, and you end up with tiny bubble holes when you are smoothing out, when you are applying your frosting to a cake. So I'm using a spatula to get a smooth frosting. Now if you are using a hand mixer, you want to use a paddle attachment. If you don't have a paddle attachment, you most likely get if I'm going to attach a picture of the mixer and the paddle attachment I'm talking about. Now for the attachments that you do not want to use, I'm going to attach an image for that. This type of attachment is going to be too aggressive for frosting, because it's going to beat too much air into the margarine and create tiny air pockets that's going to prevent your cake from looking smooth when you're decorating it. So I'm just going to stir this. I finished combining the margarine and the icing sugar. Now I'm going to just add some food color, and I diluted it in a tablespoon of water. I diluted the red food color in a tablespoon of water. I'm just going to use, I wanted to get a pink color, and I did not have pink color, so I just used little amount of red. So I just used little amount of red and I stirred that in. The water is going to the water is going to add to the smoothness of the frosting, and it's going to make it a little bit more workable. So I scraped down the wooden spatula so I can properly mix and make sure the color is totally distributed. If you have any flavor, vanilla, butterscotch, almond, you want to add that now, but I did not have any, so I'm just going to mix that. So I continued to stir until the color was completely and evenly distributed. At this point, the color was evenly distributed through the frosting. So I scraped down the wooden spatula. This is what it looks like. Next thing I'm going to do is to transfer to a piping bag. I trimmed that up a bit. I inserted the piping tip. I'm going to be using this star piping tip. So I I like to I like to cut it a little just below, just to the exact point I need to cut it to fit the piping tip, because I've had small icing incidents where the I cut it too much and the piping tip just popped right out of the piping bag while I was piping. But that usually happens when you're making like butter cookies where you have to use a piping bag. But still, I like to take precaution. So I put that in a cup and created a and opened it up before applying the frosting. After applying all the frosting I needed, I closed it up and pressed down on it to get rid of any air pockets. I had to press some frosting out before setting it aside. Next thing I did was to prepare the piping bag, another piping bag, but this would not have a piping tip. This will not have a nozzle attached to it. This is going to be the piping bag I'm going to use to coat the cake. Now I'm doing this because I want an even layer of frosting surrounding the cake, so that's why I'm using another piping bag. I'm going to transfer almost all the frosting into this piping bag. Now this measurement is quite precise because it's just to cover a 2 layer 6-inch cake, and there was barely any frosting left over. It was just enough to cover and have that design on top. So I'm going to press that down until all the frosting has moved closer to the tip. And I'm going to keep it like this until I'm ready to use it. When I'm ready to use it, I'll cut the tip. Now it's time to decorate the cake. This is the chocolate cake I'm going to be using. I'm going to prep the cake, and that's the cake board. This is my frosting. This is the frosting we made earlier, and that's the leftover frosting from the bowl. And I'm going to use these sandwich cookies, these chocolates and cream sandwich cookies. And this is the I'm going to be using a plastic bench scraper, and that's a serrated knife for usually used for crumb coating. Then I'm going to be using chocolate chip. I got this measured chocolate chip at the baking store. I'm going to be using this for the drip because I like to make my chocolate drip myself. And I'm going to be using this spatula. So I applied some tape under the cake board to make it more secure to prevent it from slipping while I'm baking. So I'm going to apply a little bit of frosting to the cake board before placing the cake on it to prevent it from slipping while carrying it or while designing it. So I'm going to place this on the pan and try to get it to the middle. So I'm going to trim the top off now. I'm going to trim it by placing my hand on the cake, securing my hand by my side, and using the I'm going to just turn the cake and keep my hand with the serrated knife steady. And after going round once, I'm going to start slowly moving to the center until the entire top has been cut off. And that's how to get a smooth trim from your cake. So I'm going to transfer the remaining frosting to the top of the cake. Now this cake is not overly frosted. It has quite a precise cake to frosting ratio, and the layer of frosting between the cake is not that thick. I don't like to apply too much frosting between cake layers because it can make the cake slide off, especially when you are unable to freeze it before you finish designing it. So I applied that, and for the second layer of cake, it was pretty flat. So I just I didn't trim the top off. I just placed it on the I flipped it and placed it on the cake there. I flipped it because the bottom of the cake is smoother, so it gives me a nice surface to work with. Now I'm just going to, as you can see, there's like a void created when between the two layers. So I'm just going to apply some frosting to cover the voids there. And after applying that, um, crumbs. I cleaned the cake crumbs from the cake board. I cut the tip from the top of the piping bag and pressed it. If you want a thicker coating, you want to cut it deeper to create a bigger outlet for the frosting. So I used that to go around the cake. Now you want to be careful here because you can run out of frosting. You don't need to apply the frosting so close to each other. When you are at the base, you can do that, but as you go closer to the top, you can space the frosting a little bit. Now, so this is what it looks like at the end. If you get if it looks messy, there's no problem at all. You're going to smoothen it out. Now I'm using a bench scraper, but it's always better to use a steel bench scraper. I did not have my steel bench scraper with me here, so I just went with this one. So I'm just going to smooth that in. This is going to give you a good finish too, but using a steel bench scraper, when you can always pour some hot water or heat up the bench scraper and use it to and run it across your frosting to get an even smoother finish. But with the right expertise, you can use this plastic bench scraper and get a good result too. So the bench scraper across the cake the first time, then I just used the frosting to fill in any hole that was left by that was left while I was working. I made sure to get out all that frosting. This recipe prevents wastage of frosting, so you want to make sure you use everything. And I went across with the bench scraper again. Another tip is to, especially when you're making bigger cake, is to clean the bench scraper as you go. So I went over the cake again, and yes, there was still some holes. Now, when going across the cake, you want to press on it a bit. If you press on it, the batter is going to spread a little bit, and some of the voids are going to get filled. So I'm just going to try and patch those voids up. I tried to be very precise because I was working with little amount of frosting. Then I went over it with the spatula again for the third time. So after doing that, I ended up with a smooth frosting. Now it's time to apply frosting to the top. Since I no longer have frosting, I'm going to use some of this meant for decorating. I'm just going to apply this. I'm going to apply little amount of frosting to the top because I'm going to be covering it with chocolate drip. So yes, I'm just going to make sure the edge is covered. It's just going to be a very thin coating of frosting. After that, I'm going to go in with the spatula to make sure the top is smooth. Now, if you have a palette knife, there's this palette knife. I want to insert the picture that has a drop down. It's better, but again, I was working with available equipment to make this cake. So I smoothed that out. I smoothed out the sides again. Before going in with a palette knife. Before going in with the palette knife to just smooth out the top like this. This covering the top of the cake is. I'm going to try and cover. I try to cover it a bit to encourage the flow of the chocolate drip when I get to that point eventually. So this is what the cake looks like covered. I'm going to place this in the fridge. It's always better to freeze your cake. Next thing I did was the chocolate drip. I don't usually measure here. I added some margarine a into an iron plate and chocolate chip, and I melted that over a double boiler. Then I sifted some icing sugar and poured some into it. Now, when you melt chocolate chip and butter and margarine, it's pretty light, so I'm just going to add icing sugar until I get a thick, runny consistency, a thick consistency that I can work with. So I'm just going to add a tablespoon at a time until I get a nice consistency like this. You want to stir that to avoid any lump. Now this is the consistency I reached. Now I'm just going to pour that on the cake. When I pour it on the cake, I'm going to take it to the side to drip it over the side of the cake. If you're working with limited amount of chocolate sauce, you can just drip it on the side alone. No need to pour it all over the top like I'm doing. So this is basically what I did to get the drip. I just poured the chocolate. Although I did not totally ration it completely because I ran out of chocolate drip, but I was kind of able to just spread it out a bit to make sure the entire top was covered. And I tried to get out all the chocolate drip that was left in the plate to create some sort of drip on the other side. Then I went in with a spatula and smoothing it out a bit. And I created this swirling design on top. You can freeze the cake before piping the top, but this chocolate drip allows me to work right after applying it to the cake. So I just went in with my piping tip and created little designs on the top. I cut the cookies into half before placing them in between the piping design. And that's how the cake looked when I was done. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. If you have any questions, please ask me in the comments below. Thank you for watching.